Temple for many years. I have listened to countless sermons by Rabbi Wolpe, countless chants by Cantor Gold and Cantor Brown, countless performances by Craig Taubman. Does he still do the Friday Night Lives? Saturdays now. So it's an honor to be here and to stand on their shoulders, maybe even a little intimidating, but I'm glad. Mazel tov to the bat mitzvah girl and to your family. It's a privilege for me to be here today when it's your simcha. Because as you know, in our faith, in Jewish tradition, we don't delay celebrations. It's an incredibly Jewish idea that even in the face of tragedy, we celebrate. And that's what this day is about. It's about joy, love, and hope. And we need that hope now. We need that hope more than ever. We need it because we're coming together today and our hearts are still broken and scarred. You can't stand here on this bima, you can't sit here in the sanctuary and not listen to what Rabbi Sherman just said, the names and the names and the names of our boys and girls, our brothers and sisters who are over there right now defending Eretz Yisrael. You can't be here in this place and not see those empty chairs and not be moved. All of us are in mourning, and no one knows what the future holds. But it's kind of an odd feeling, I think, because even while we don't know what the future holds, it feels like the past is here. A past we know all too well. Indeed, I think for all of us, October the 7th was horrifying and shocking and dislocating. And yet, I think in some way it was familiar. Because I think it was familiar in that it harkened back to a previous time, to stories that we heard from our grandparents or our great-grandparents, stories that we heard from members of this congregation like Max Webb. We all heard them, stories about Cossacks mauling Jews in the Pale of Settlement, or Nazis beating and burning Jews in broad daylight in Berlin, or once docile neighbors suddenly seized by bloodlust and murdering Jews in Shiraz or Mashhad. But all of that seemed so far away. These were hazy recollections that you heard about. These were grainy black and white photos. This was pages of a history book, except now it isn't. Like many of you, I have family right now in Israel under siege. We have other family members who are deployed to the front lines. I have staff who are taking Zoom calls from bomb shelters. I'm on conference calls that are interrupted by sirens. And I have friends who are gone. Just gone. In fact, about 10 days after the massacre, the body of my 14-year-old son's camp counselor finally was identified. Can you imagine that we had hoped he had been kidnapped? What kind of hope is that? I'm not going to recount the savage atrocities that took place on October the 7th. I mean, it's hard to believe that the Shloshim, The 30-day anniversary is already right around the corner because the pain still feels so raw and so recent. Maybe that's because these horrifying videos are still coming out and flooding my WhatsApp. These grotesque images seem to be all over social media, and the sad stories whispered between friends, and the faces of those posters. Innocent hostages as young as infants staring back at me. I don't know about you, but I wake up at night haunted by these images. I drift during the day, broken by these pictures. And I am just shattered by these stories, just shattered. I think what we've witnessed is just beyond imagination. It's beyond language. I mean that literally. We don't have language. We don't have the words to describe what happened. Think about it. The word genocide. The word genocide. It was coined by an American Jewish lawyer in 1944 to describe the annihilation of the Armenian people at the hands of the Ottoman Empire. Or the term Holocaust. That was not a broadly accepted term until a few decades ago after a miniseries of the same name popularized it. So we simply don't have a word to describe what happened on October the 7th. The kind of evil that we saw, and it was evil, that was perpetrated at such scale, with such rage, at such velocity. I think it's tested all of us to the breaking point. You know, in a way, I would say that this relates to the Parsha, to Vayera. It's perhaps, and you know, you're blessed, it's maybe the most consequential parasha of the year. Because in it, God tests Abraham again and again and again to explore the depths of his commitment. And famously, the tests end when Abraham is ready to sacrifice Isaac at the request of God. And God says, okay. But Abraham was ready to take that bold step, that extraordinary step that prompts the Lord to intervene because Abraham's loyalty, his loyalty to God, has been tested and proven strong. I'm thinking a lot about loyalty these days. First of all, I'm thinking about loyalty because I am blown away by the loyalty that I see among our people. In my 8 years as ADL CEO, I've never seen the Jewish people so united. Yes, there's a self-loathing, lunatic fringe, and we need to keep them on the fringe. But the vast majority of Jews, just down there, Hale, the vast majority of Jews in our community are more united than I have ever seen. They are standing up, locking arms, together. They are with our brothers and sisters in Sderot and Be'eri, in Metula and Kiryat Shmona, and the loyalty to one another, the devout and the reform, the religious and the secular, Ashkenazi, Sephardi and Mizrahi, rich and poor. It is inspiring. But even as we marvel at that unity, and while I am, and if you take one thing away from this morning, remember that I am absolutely certain that Israel will overcome and she will win. But what I don't have the same certainty about is how to repair one failure. Not the intelligence failure of the Shin Bet. It will be corrected. Not the military failure of the IDF. It too will be resolved. What I worry about is the moral failure of our supposed friends, the learned and the progressive, right here. To be clear, I'm not saying this is a universal condition. I really don't care about your politics. But I will say this. President Biden has been absolutely rock solid in his support for the state of Israel. From his words to his actions to visiting the country under fire, when his advisors said no, he said yes. And again, if you know the Parsha, he said, Hineni. He said, here I am. And in fact, the vast majority of elected officials have been outstanding. And there are others, nonprofits like the National Action Network, the Asian American Foundation, celebrities like Bono and Madonna. They spoke up without hesitation. They showed compassion and empathy. And yet, the collapse of what we might call the progressive sphere, it is not alarming. It is a catastrophe, an utter disaster. There is no justice in a so-called social justice movement that tears down the posters of hostages. There is nothing liberating or progressive about Islamic fascists who execute the elderly, who rape women, and who brutalize children. And yet, why is it so hard for so many people to recognize this? A pathetic mentality of moral relativism has seized our media, captured so many of our universities, and overtaken, it would seem, pillar after pillar of our society. Even our most prestigious institutions seem incapable of calling out anti-Semitism with the same clarity, with the same conviction they bring to nearly every other social issue, every conceivable grievance, every imagined microaggression. But when Hamas, and it was Hamas, issues a press release, a blood libel, accusing Israel of targeting a hospital and killing hundreds, the media breathlessly reports it without any regard for the truth. And then they barely issue a correction, let alone acknowledge the gravity of the error. And even as Jews have been maimed and murdered, kidnapped and killed, they hesitate. Somehow they struggle to find the words. It isn't evil, they tell us. It's understandable. It isn't wicked. It's justified. It isn't rape. It's resistance. And I worry deeply because it's obvious that this sickness won't be confined to the squad, that it won't stay on the campus, at the student center. It's a kind of moral degeneracy, and it's not going to remain locked on the op-ed pages of the Daily Bruin. Indeed, these students, they graduate and they move on to the assignment desks of news networks, to the CSR departments of corporations, to the mailrooms of talent agencies, to the desks of our courts, to the halls of Congress. It is harrowing, but there are some hopeful signs. Alumni from Harvard and Penn are holding the administrations accountable for their cowardice. And thank God for alumni like Mark Rowan and Bill Ackman, John Huntsman and Ken Griffin, Jews and Gentiles who are making this push. Law firms like Winston & Strawn and Davis Polk are rescinding offers and reminding students that they will pay a price for anti-Jewish prejudice. Now, admittedly, I don't know about you, but I've heard some complaints. Some are saying, you shouldn't cancel these kids. You shouldn't cancel these universities. Let's be clear. This situation, these examples are not cancel culture. This is not canceling someone for mislabeling a person's pronouns or mistakenly committing some microaggression. That's cancel culture. This is consequence culture. This is our community and society stepping up and saying, if you intimidate Jewish children, if you threaten Jewish students, if you slander Jewish people, we will respond. There will be consequences. That's not just a good thing, that's a necessary thing. So we should see these situations not as outliers, but examples. Not as moments, but models. Models that we can learn from, that all of you can learn from, because they illustrate what each of us can do, what you can do. Everyone wears a different hat, but everyone can play a role. You can do it as an alumni, as a donor, as an employer, as an executive, as a shareholder, as an investor, as a creative, as a consumer, as a student. You all have more agency and more power than you realize. We have momentum, something we can build from, not just to save our people, although that would be enough, but to save society. And that's crucial. This fight isn't just our fight as Jews. Let me say that again. This isn't just our fight as a Jewish people. Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, she's written, anti-Semitism, it starts with the Jews, never ends with the Jews. You see, this is a fire with the potential to consume everything. Remind your non-Jewish friends that this is not our fight, it's an American fight. There were dozens of Americans slaughtered that day by Hamas. There are still Americans held in the tunnels, in the hellholes of Gaza. And Hamas, along with its allies in Hezbollah, and the tyrants in Iran, they have blood on their hands for the Americans that they have killed and murdered over the decades in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, in Europe, and right here in this country. Now, it will take time to extinguish this blaze of hate lit by Hamas that's consumed so many of our institutions. It will take years to put out the fire, to repair the damage, to rebuild from the debris. But you think this is hard? You think this is difficult? This pales in comparison to what our brothers and sisters are facing in Israel right now. But it is just as existential. We can't afford, you can't afford, to take our lives here in America for granted. And if you don't think so, if you think I'm exaggerating, you're kidding yourselves. On October 6th, you had an excuse. On October 7th, you have none. Does this mean you give up on being a progressive if that's how you identify? No, far from it. Don't misinterpret me. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that we can't afford to frame this in the same political lens that's already divided our country, that I know has already divided this community, Rabbi Sherman. This isn't about being a Democrat or a Republican. This isn't about the red team versus the blue team. This is about good versus evil. This is about the fate of Israel and the fate of America and the fate of our civilization. And so, you need to put aside partisanship and fight with the same ferociousness for our ideas, for our values, as our brothers and sisters in the IDF are fighting for their lives. In conclusion, let's remember the message of this parsha, the importance of loyalty, and let's recommit never to be silent in the face of evil, never to stand down when confronted by hate, never to be quiet in the face of anti-Semitism, never again, never is now. Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael Chai.